So recently we've seen the emergence of the closed beta for Cataclysm Classic, giving us a brief glimpse of what's to come in the next stage of the classic genre. And for the expansion, it's the biggest facelift that Azeroth has seen so far, with many players jumping both on and off the bandwagon for the upcoming release, with Cataclysm bringing major changes to guilds, classes, races, and a big step up for raids and dungeons. And to be fair, there's some great content due in this expansion, as well as the return of some particularly memorable moments from the original tenure back in 2010.
Watch your clever mouth, bitch.
Yeah, you guessed it, boys, that's back in the game. So let's take a look at what you can expect in Cata Classic when the expansion finally does come around. But just before we jump in, as always, feel free to like and subscribe if you're new here, as it helps me out a bunch. So thanks very much indeed. Now, let's get on with it. So let's first take a look at a big social change that is coming with the developments to how guild systems work in Cataclysm. What we get in Cata is pretty much a big restructure of how guilds work, that are no longer simply groups of people vibing together, and now provide some central structure achievements that can be chased together, and they aren't only kept to raiding. And this allows you to gain heirlooms and mounts in exchange for such efforts that turn out to help with leveling alts as well as styling on your fellow players, and is basically a more simplistic version of what we currently have in retail WoW. So for any retail players that are coming over to try out Cata, hopefully you feel a bit more at home with the implementation of this new guild system. Now, the biggest change brought through the expansion is certainly the world revamp and the onset of what this does for the player experience. And I think it's important to note that we're lucky to be in a time where there are so many versions of WoW available. So if you realise the new upcoming revamp isn't for you, hopefully you can find a home in Vanilla Era or Season of Discovery for something that suits you better. Now, the world revamp quite literally reshaped the world, and from this, besides the epic new scenery which you'll be seeing, did change the way in which you experience Cataclysm as both a new player and when you're trying to progress through levels 80 to 85, including the introduction of world flying to the original contents of Azeroth, which had only previously been available in Outland and Northrend. But lower level zones like Durotar and Thousand Needles, for example, experienced major changes, and something that ultimately came with that large change was to the leveling experience of levels 1 to 58, which provided a different guise and a bit of a freshen up to these levels that hadn't changed since vanilla. Personally, I think some of these new quests were top notch, and it was interesting to see how characters you'd interacted with for years were dealing with the cataclysm of their homes. Also, and it dealt with the issue that sometimes expansions can feel disconnected from the rest of the world. However, Cataclysm throws both new players and your alts into the fire. Quite literally. This means that you can expect Cata as an expansion will feel present throughout your entire playthrough, besides when you go through Burning Crusade and Wrath for levels 58 to 78. Yet, if you never did these new quests from Cata's original release, or you're new to Cata entirely, it's a really interesting experience to go through the revamped old world and see how even smaller corners of Azeroth have been changed by Deathwing's destruction. Now, for levels 80 to 85, if you're coming into Cata at max level, we also get some pretty unique and exciting zones to quest in, showing a great variation and some epic displays of scenery, with the new main zones being the Twilight Highlands, which is full of old god goop, Vashir, which is full of water, Deep Home, which is full of rocks, Uldum, which is full of sand, and Mount Hyjal, which is now, well, it's on fire. These zones bring endgame back to Azeroth as a whole, dotted around the world in an attempt to make players feel like the game is set within the World of Warcraft once again, much like vanilla did, as we're no longer constrained to a single continent or a different world, seeing the rise of cities being main player hubs once again, typically with Stormwind and Orgrimmar. Now, like mentioned, each environment has its own selling point, such as Vashir, which was a very impressive underwater zone, and something we hadn't really seen in World of Warcraft before, but one that ultimately back in the day did make my laptop overheat, dropping to 3 frames a second before tragically exploding. And these zones from a visual perspective do make you feel like you're in a familiar place of Azeroth, but you are certainly not at home, as the world has woken up to fight back and you're truly in the elements. For me, I enjoyed the questing experience, but do be ready for some slightly goofy quest lines here and there, such as a clear reference to Indiana Jones in Uldum, which I'll let you discover for yourself. And alongside Deathwing essentially shaking up the world, we get the new races, with both goblins being added to Horde and Worgens being added to Alliance. And for me, although I dive between Alliance and Horde nowadays depending on which WoW I'm playing, Gilneas as the Worgen starting zone remains one of my favourite all-time new player areas, as there's just something real spooky to the whole experience, providing a sense of emergency and fear as if you're playing through a true Victorian nightmare, seeing some great quests and fun encounters. So if you are fancying to start a new alt to experience the new world, or earlier level quests in Cataclysm, I'd also really recommend recommend checking out the Worgen starting zone in Gilneas if you already haven't done so in retail at some point. Now, whilst Cataclysm didn't provide us with any new classes, each class did get a major redesign in some way, alongside new race-class combinations that players could pursue. For example, it didn't really make sense we didn't have human hunters, but Cata introduced human hunters, and then we also got combinations like Tauren paladins. So if you're feeling particularly like a cow dedicating itself to the light, time to get your holy udders on and re-roll your class. With class changes, the main thing that we really saw was how resources changed alongside new talents. As a few examples, paladins got holy power that built up during fights and were used for skills alongside mana, seeing a far cry from the days when rep paladins would simply go in vanilla. And hunters had a complete resource change, where they no longer used mana, and now used focus, a resource that depletes and regenerates similar to rogues, as well as the fact that ammunition was removed from the game, so hunters no longer had to worry about running out of ammo mid-fight. It's a great time to potentially re-roll your main or check out a few new alts you might want to try, and I'll be sure to go over the more specifics of each class in the future on the channel. So it's worth expecting that if you're continuing on from Wrath to Cata, it's likely you'll have to adjust on some scale to some new class changes. But don't worry all too much, as there's nothing tricky coming in these changes. You can very easily stick with your main. Yet that classic feeling to classes will now be going in some ways, so it's a prime time to shift around and maybe shop for something new if you're fancying it. Moving on to endgame content, Cata brings about a feel of challenge once again for those who maybe felt Wrath content had become a little stale. Now, normal 5-man dungeons are actually fine, but you'll certainly begin to feel a little bit of a challenge in the 5-man heroics, where we see the requirement of basic 5-man tactics finally re-emerge, and the sad death of face-rolling dungeons. But don't be too put off. The dungeons are great and typically reflect the leveling zones I mentioned, i.e. there's going to be lots of sand, water, and fire. And as long as you come to grips with the basic challenge of crowd control and the order in which to kill mobs once again, you'll have an absolute blast. We also saw the return of some old vanilla content you might recognise, but thrust back into the endgame for a 5-man dungeon makeover, with old fan favourites like Dead Mines getting a bit of a facelift, as well as the return of Zul'Gurub and Zulaman, but in 5-man dungeon form, to provide a bit of a gear boost for those who hadn't quite made it into raiding yet. And moving on to raiding, Cata might have a controversial reputation at times, but one thing that is usually agreed upon is that raiding was pretty great. Well, prior to Dragon Soul. Yes, we get some shiny new raids to kick the expansion off, including Bastion of Twilight, Blackwing Descent, Throne of the Four Winds, and Barradin Hold, with Barradin Hold essentially being the new Vault of Archivon, where you can claim both PvE and PvP gear. As a result, we do see a bit of a better split content-wise for the start of Cata, where in Wrath, the majority of the bosses at the start of raiding were in Naxx. In Cata, the majority are split between Blackwing Descent and Bastion of Twilight, with Bastion of Twilight being my favourite of the initial raids, as we dive into a lair filled with corruption, giant dragons, and old god juice that is kind of going everywhere, as well as bosses with slightly too many eyes. But Blackwing Descent was great also, providing an aspect of nostalgia for some vanilla players, serving as the continuation of Blackwing Lair, as Nefarian makes his glorious return. And not to leave out Throne of the Four Winds, which visually and mechanically was a great and very fun raid, which sees you flying through the air like you're Aang the Avatar himself, but just try not to fall down too much. Now, an interesting aspect to these initial raids was that unless you got summoned to the entrances of the raids, or inside by a warlock, they were only accessible by flying mounts, which really did separate the men from the boys, in terms of who had made the clever decision to save up their money for paying for the new world flying skill, and those who embarrassingly had to ask for a summon, which was mainly me. So there's just a quick blast of some of the great changes and content we'll get to see when Cataclysm Classic finally comes around. And hopefully some of that might take your fancy in either giving this expansion a go for the first time, or maybe returning as an old player to see how it fares over a decade on. I'm sure we'll get far more news to come out of this, and some of the more specific changes that we'll see to Cata for the classic genre after the betas. So be sure to stick around, as we'll be taking a look at all of that for sure. But all in all, do let me know what you're looking forward to most about Cataclysm Classic, and just how you'll be taking on the expansion this time around in the comments. As always, feel free to like and subscribe if you're new here. And on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.